Welcome back to the Colorado Victim Advocate Podcast. Appreciate all of you coming back to us again. This podcast is sponsored by Intervention, Inc., a Colorado-based nonprofit organization created in 1986, providing a range of services in the criminal and social justice system. Intervention provides direct offender supervision and support for those justice-involved persons sentenced to probation or community corrections. In addition, we also provide pretrial monitoring, useful public service, and comprehensive victim services. For more information, you can visit our website at www.int-cjs.org. Our podcast highlights the wonderful and necessary work of the Colorado victim advocate community, but also with organizations that provide training and resources for victims of crime and service providers. Our very special guest today is Kim Branham, the Victim Rights Act Specialist at the Colorado Division of Criminal Justice. Welcome, Kim.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being here because, as you know, next week, the week of April 6th, is National Crime Victim Rights Week, and we're truly glad to have you here today, and that's why we wanted to have this podcast, because the work that Kim does at DCJ immediately goes towards the work that all of us service providers do, and her knowledge and her assistance and her expertise have been very valuable to all of the work that goes on here in the advocacy community. But I would like to ask, Kim, just some discussion questions. But Kim, first off, tell us what your role is as the VRA, the Victim Rights Act Specialist at the Division of Criminal Justice.
Yeah, so I work with victims when they feel that their rights have been violated underneath our Colorado Constitution of the Victim Rights Act. And I will investigate any sort of complaint that they have made against a criminal agency that has responsibilities underneath the VRA. I will also provide training on the VRA to all of our criminal justice agencies that have responsibilities under the VRA and our nonprofit agencies. And then I provide technical assistance for those agencies that have responsibilities underneath the VRA.
And so, with a lot that you talked about right there, a lot of folks may not understand what the VRA is, what the Victim Rights Act is. And so could you tell us about that? Because those of us who work in this field, that is the one piece that we always make sure that we're in compliance with. But I would like you to talk about that to, folks who might not have an understanding about what the Victim Rights Act is.
Yeah, so the Victim Rights Act ensures that crime victims are treated with fairness, respect, and dignity, and that they're informed of critical stages throughout our criminal justice process. The amendment ensures that victims have the right to be informed, present, and heard when it's relevant.
And so when you say informed, present, and heard, I mean, are we talking the literal definition of those words, like actually being physically notified, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so victims have the right to be informed in critical stages. So, for example, they have the right to be informed with a law enforcement agency when a suspect is taken into custody or when they are released from custody. They would also have the right to be informed from our district attorney's office of court hearings and court dates. They can also be They can be present at certain hearings. Not all of them can they be heard at, meaning that they can talk to the judge and address the judge regarding certain critical stages and throughout the process.
And so also too, so that would include the right to be present. Would that be like the physical right to be present? And is that specific towards the district attorney process, or like within, say, for instance, a Department of Corrections hearing of some kind?
Yeah, absolutely. So they can attend all the court hearings and be present in all of the court hearings. They may not be able to speak and address to the judge in every single court hearing, but they can at least be present. That also includes being present for community corrections hearings, parole hearings with the Department of Corrections.
And so, as an advocate, as a service provider, we always want to make sure that we're providing those services to folks. But, if you can talk about that, because, there's obviously a lot of crimes. And if you could just, talk to us a little bit about what those crimes are that are covered in the Victim Rights Act.
Yeah, not all crimes are covered underneath the VRA. Most of them are your person crimes, so domestic violence, sexual assault cases, homicides, robberies. Those are crimes that are covered underneath the VRA. Some crimes that are not covered are your auto thefts, your thefts by themselves. So those are a couple that aren't, but typically the way we look at it is your person's crimes.
And so in talking about that with regards to the specific crimes, do those crimes, are they, part of the work that advocates do? And do you see a lot of those folks who might be trying to contact you as maybe those crimes that are not listed in the Victim Rights Act?
Our victim advocates would help those victims that are not crimes that are covered underneath the VRA. However, if that victim felt that their rights were violated, they wouldn't be able to file a VRA complaint because it wouldn't be under the purview of the VRA because it's not a crime that's covered.
And so you talked about right now with regards to, the different parts of the Victim Rights Act. And you talked about, some of the pieces of it. But, as far as like, what are some of the roles that are just always present throughout the entire criminal justice system with regards to the Victim Rights Act? I mean, what I'm asking is like, what are the things that is always there with law enforcement level, prosecution, post-conviction? I mean, is that always there with the dignity, fairness, and respect in all those levels?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of our agencies have to treat our victims with fairness, respect, and dignity. It is the number one right that victims have in our Victim Rights Act. And what we look at when we look at that fairness, respect, and dignity is the tone of voice that we're using when we work with our victims. Are we using too much legal jargon? Are we talking down to them? Are we taking the time to answer their phone calls in a timely manner? Or we also often look to see, was this an egregious act? Are we just intentionally rude, inappropriate to the victim? And that does fall through all of our agencies in our criminal justice system have to abide by that fairness, respect, and dignity for all victims.
And so in looking at that, I mean, so let's say, for instance, because you did talk on that, and I'd like you to expand on it. So let's say, for instance, if a victim did feel like their rights were violated, and, what would their first steps be if they felt that way?
We always encourage the victim to resolve it locally within their own, within the criminal justice system, or within the agency that they're working with. However, if they don't feel that that's resolved that conflict for them, they can always reach out to me. My first step would also try to resolve it locally with that agency first before it gets to a formal complaint. However, sometimes the victim doesn't want us to try to intervene as a mediation, and they would rather just file that formal complaint.
And so from that point, if they do contact you and they're actually talking, or they've told you that they felt that their rights were violated, and you did contact the local agency, and they wanted to go forward with a formal complaint, what's the next step that goes from there?
I always talk to the victim about what is their goal for filing the formal complaint. So are they filing it because they want somebody to lose their law license, or they want somebody to be fired, or some financial duress from it? We have no discretion regarding that. So our goal is always system change. We want to make sure that this doesn't happen again to other victims. Unfortunately, we can't go back and fix what has already happened. So we can't make the courts rehold a hearing if it was held and the victim didn't have the right to be heard regarding that hearing. So we can't do that. But my first step is always to let the victim know what our goals are for filing the complaint and find out what their goals are. If their goal is not system change, this may not be the right process for them.
And so in dealing with that, because, as a service provider, we're very fortunate that, you list and you publish to us, those investigations that the VRA subcommittee has looked at. And it just appears from what you've shown us that the majority of the complaints are at the prosecution level. And when I was asked that question, why is that? I mean, my response was that, well, it appears that they have the majority of the responsibilities under the VRA. Is that correct?
Yeah, we typically see more complaints come across for our district attorney's offices, but yes, you're absolutely correct. It is because they have more responsibilities underneath the VRA. We also see more with law enforcement as well, would probably be our second agency that has the most, and they also that is also because they have a lot more requirements than our post-sentencing agencies have.
And so it does appear that, a good amount of the work that you do is really trying to provide education and awareness, not only to those persons that are contacting you who think they have a complaint, but you're also trying to give to those agencies the same amount of information, education as to how the VRA works. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that is where that training piece comes in, where we try to be proactive with an agency to provide them training on it. We do see an uptick of training that I have to do when we have new district attorneys that have been elected. Will come in and do more training. The same thing when we have new chiefs of police or new sheriffs that come in. They often have me come out to their department and train their department on the Victim Rights Act. And a lot of times when you have those new elected officials that are coming in, that's because you also have a turnover of staff and a lot of new attorneys that are coming in, or new law enforcement officers that are coming into that agency that need to be trained or have a refresher on the Victim Rights Act.
And it does appear that, here in Colorado, because I've been very fortunate, to, see other states and work with other states, with regards to victim rights matters. And, it really does seem like, we are more progressive with regards to our victim rights here in Colorado than other states. But, for myself that's been working in this field for so long and seeing the changes that have come with it, I see them as really being reflective of just how things go with new crimes. Because I remember when I started being a victim's advocate, I like to tell people back in the 1900s, there wasn't really a listing for human trafficking in the Colorado revised statutes. There wasn't a listing really, or an expansive listing of crimes against at-risk adults, things like that. I mean, do you see the work that we do as being progressive much more so than some other, jurisdictions, some other states? Because I really do feel like that we're really out there first and foremost, much more so than a lot of other places.
Yeah, I like to often brag that Colorado has the leading Victim Rights Act in our nation. We do have a lot of states that look to Colorado to try to understand how we got certain crimes passed, or how we got certain crimes or certain legislation passed into the VRA. So they look to us for that guidance. Also, Colorado is the only state that provides automatic notification to all of our victims without the victim having to opt into it, with the exception of probation. So all of our criminal justice agencies are providing information and education to victims, and it's more of an opt-out process, where probation victims do have to opt in to receive that notification, but they're the only criminal justice agency in Colorado that requires that. And we are the only state that has that. All other states require a victim to opt in. Almost at every single phase, they have to contact that agency to say, I want to be notified. I want you to update me on my case. The reason why Colorado, we changed that is because we felt that it's one less thing that the victim has to do. To have to request that notification. So if they're receiving information from law enforcement and then the case gets turned over to the district attorney's office, they shouldn't have to call the DA's office and say, okay, now I want to be notified of my case moving forward, and then go to probation and do it, and then go to the DA or to the Department of Corrections and do it. So again, it's just trying to streamline the process and make it easier for victims to have to manage.
And so in looking at that process that has been working, for me as an advocate, seeing again the institutional changes that have been coming from that, I mean, do you see, any additional changes that might be coming, down the road later on, and not so much from, a standpoint of a policy, but I just know, the work that you've done in your career, do you see, additional changes that could be coming to the system? Because I always kind of look at it like, well, yeah, I mean, we get new crimes that occur and we have to make changes. Do you see something like that possibly, in the work that you do?
I do. We open up the VRA, for lack of better terms, to make changes in that statute probably about every 5 years. The last time we made changes was in 22, kind of 23 timeframe. So we're actually getting on that point where we're probably going to be drafting some more language, adding more changes. I will constantly keep a list of changes that we need to fix in the VRA. So maybe it's something where we have conflicting statute that we need to go in and update the VRA. This is also the time where we would add new crimes or add new legislation. So we're probably looking maybe in a couple years of opening up that VRA again to adding new changes to it. But I do have a list, and honestly, it's probably 2 to 3 pages long. And every day I have something that somebody calls me on and says, hey, can I get this as an addition, or have you considered adding this into the VRA? And I add it to my list, and we'll tackle that probably in a couple years.
And that's really, kind of what I've always saw as setting us apart, because whenever I've worked, as long as I've worked in this field, I really try to tell folks, especially victims of crime, tragically when they're contacting us, we're trying to explain to them what the process is. And unfortunately, they just feel flooded with the information that they're receiving. And the work that we do within this field, coordinating, collaborating, I think that's a really important piece too. And do you see that as, something that we as advocates really should be doing more of, especially because here in the state we have several different, geographic ranges. We have the Eastern Plains. Their roles are going to be, or their crimes that they're seeing are different than what we may see here in Metro, or what they may see in Alamosa, or in Grand Junction, or in Fort Collins. I mean, do you see the collaboration, that's been working so well to this point?
Yes, and part of my other job of what I do is that I coordinate all of our district attorney victim witness directors together. So we meet quarterly, and I'm the one that helps organize those. I also have a group with the law enforcement coordinators, victim advocates, and we will meet quarterly as well. So I'm kind of in charge of those. But the great thing about having those meetings is that you've got everybody across the state in law enforcement, victim advocates that are coming together quarterly to meet, to talk about trends, to talk about what maybe their department are struggling with that they're seeing. And it's a great way to speak to each other, to find out ways that this worked well for us, maybe this would work well for you. One of the big thing that we're seeing right now is trending is that we don't have enough volunteer advocates that are helping out with our law enforcement agencies and our district attorney's office. And unfortunately, a lot of times in victim services, that's how we do our work, is through volunteers. So anybody who is interested in ever volunteering for a law enforcement agency or a DA's office, please reach out to your local communities. There are always opportunities, and we're always interested in having advocates and coming on board.
And I think that's a really great piece to bring out, Kim. I really do, because, beginning my career, I was a volunteer victim advocate with Westminster PD. I certainly always want to thank Barb, Kim, and Jackie for giving me that start. But starting as a volunteer, it was incredible. In fact, I spoke to somebody this morning who wanted to know more about getting into victim services as an advocate. And I did tell them specifically that. I said, reach out to your local police department, your local sheriff's office. And in fact, most, if not all of those organizations, they will have a Victim Advocate Academy where you can be certified. And quite frankly, as somebody who does hiring for those positions, that's the kind of person I'm looking for to come work for us. Somebody who's already been out there in the field as a volunteer. Because as a volunteer, I remember I went to my very first call out was to St. Anthony's North Hospital when it was in Westminster, and going out there and going to all of the kinds of calls. And I think that's really important too, to bring that up with regards to having a volunteer group out there assisting people too. And I would probably say too, or I would ask you too, as we kind of come close to of this podcast episode, what do you see that has really made you feel like you're making a difference in the lives of people? Because, I have to say too, that you and I have known each other for years. And, I always kind of look at it myself as like, I got off the phone with somebody, did I help them? Did I feel like, I gave them this much information? But what do you feel like really makes you feel good about the work that you do?
I think a lot of it is when you have a victim who comes to me, and of course they're coming to me and they're frustrated and they're upset because not only have they had to manage their own trauma of being a victim of a crime. But now they've gone through a criminal justice system, and our criminal justice system is not always kind. It's not always fair when it comes to victims, and it's hard to understand that. And I've been working in this system for 25 years, and I still don't understand it. But to have somebody who's never had to go through that process, so by the time they get to me, they're frustrated and they feel that their rights have been violated and they haven't been upheld. So by them filing a complaint through our office and going through our process, it's a way to validate them. It is a way for them to say, okay, I know this happened to me, but I've made change within that department, and maybe they won't do this to another victim, so it's easier for that other victim. Some things that we look at: if a victim filed a complaint and our VRA subcommittee determined that there was a violation, there was a basis in fact to that violation, some things that we would look to do based on that system change is training. So has their department had a VRA training? And if not, let's get in there. Let's do one. And it's mandatory for the entire department. So for example, there was a complaint even against the Department of Corrections. We made the entire Department of Corrections go through a VRA training. Now, this was during COVID and it was virtual. So we had over 500 people that were attending these trainings, right? But it's not just the one individual or two individuals that violated the rights. It's the entire department that would have to go through that. The other thing that we look at doing is policy change. So what's your policy around this? How did you, let's, for example, a law enforcement agency did not provide a VRA brochure to a victim, and there's 5 or 6 different rights that are within that one brochure by just giving them that brochure. So by not providing them that brochure, they violated 6 rights. So what we could do is show us your policy on how you provide a VRA brochure to a victim. And maybe that's because they don't have one. Maybe it's because they need to update it, or maybe it's because it needs to get dispersed across their entire agency again for everybody to read it as a reminder. So those are some things that we could do. We also ask a victim, what do you want to see happen if you file a complaint? And we've had some victims that have come back and said, I would just like to sit down with the elected DA, or I would like to sit down with the police chief or the sheriff. Now, I may not be able to get you the sheriff or the elected DA, but I'm going to work on getting you an undersheriff, or, the deputy DA, a senior DA that may be able to help. So those are some things that we have done if there are violations. And I do think that asking the victim what they want to see happen through this process is very healing to them, and it's validating to them.
And that's, I think, something too that victims advocates, why we have this podcast is because, we want to highlight those folks that are working out there in this field, that are doing the hard work, that are giving the notifications, that are providing, if you're a law enforcement based advocate, you tragically might have to give a death notification. You may have to respond, to a children's hospital for a child that's been harmed, or you may have to, contact Blue Bench for a sexual assault victim, or, at the DA level, you may have to give, a notification, as to why the victim has to be, at a special hearing because they've been subpoenaed, or, at the post-conviction level, like you and I have worked at, letting somebody know that, a warrant has been issued or an escape occurs. And I think those are important pieces too that we work with. But I guess finally too, looking, because as I said, we will be right in the middle of National Crime Victim Rights Week. And I think that's important too for advocates, not only to celebrate the work that we do, but also to honor those folks who are victims of crime. And with regards to that, looking at the National Crime Victim Rights Week, Kim, kind of give me your piece of, just why do you think that's important that we have it?
Yeah, I think it's important to honor victims. I always say it's hard that we've had an entire year and only 1 week is dedicated to victims. I feel like it's something we should do more than just 1 week. But I also think it's a way to bring our communities together and do activities, do proclamations, meet on the steps of the Capitol to say this is something we need to acknowledge, that victims need to be aware that there are services and there are resources that are available to them, and not just during 1 week of the year, but it is 1 week that we can show appreciation for our criminal justice agencies that are doing a great job.
And certainly too, we really appreciate all the work that you're doing, Kim. And Kim, I want to thank you for being here today and for the work that you and your team do. If you would like additional information on the Colorado Crime Victim Rights Act and the services that they provide, please go to their website at www.dcj.colorado.gov. The Colorado Victim Advocate podcast can be found on Spotify and on our YouTube channel, and we hope that you can join us for another episode. As you've heard today, the work that Kim does, the work that all of our victims advocates do, I always like to say that, a victim advocate, is a noun, it's a subject, it's a verb, and it's an adjective. And the work that we do, it's very important. It's part of the criminal justice system, and we're very thankful that you're here today for us. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you for having me.